everyone. We're starting, I think, our final panel for the symposium. It's been really a great day and a half, and really it's nice to be able to have this conversation after hearing a lot about the amazing work that the winners and also a lot of the folks who showed up today have been doing in the trenches of the open internet and local communities. So I think that the concrete examples are really, really inspiring. And I wanted to, with this closing discussion, to really start, just reflecting back on what the question that we opened the morning with, what the stakes are in the work that we're doing. What are the broader social goals that we're pursuing, as well as what are the broader structural, institutional, social, economic kinds of constraints that we're working under, even though we may share a lot of values about what we want this world of open learning to look like. I think there's a lot of questions in terms of strategy and approach and what our space of leverage really is. And I wanted, we really wanted this event to focus more on learning and less on things like business models and institutional politics and things like that. But I think that it is also really important to keep the very real constraints that all of us who care about learning and education work under in our day-to-day lives, and that structure the broader goals and how we evaluate our successes and targets, and kind of get that back in the picture before we move into a closing discussion about what we all want to do next and what we might want to do together as next steps, given the kind of incredible innovation that's happening, but also the very real constraints and limits on resources and bandwidth that we're all facing in the work that we do. And as an anthropologist, I've done a lot of work around technology innovation, around education and learning, and I know that history tends not to be on our side, that often as these things play out, there's small groups of really committed innovators doing really, really awesome things. And then when the big incumbents and organizations catch wind of it, something happens to these incredible innovations as they get institutionalized and incorporated and mainstreamed. And I think we're at a moment with open learning, and we saw this with the entry of our big elite institutions and MOOCs into the picture, that these innovations that we've been seeing ever since, as JSB signaled with OER, this isn't something new. It's been around, it's been bubbling up in the ecosystem. I think a lot of the projects we've heard from are very mature kinds of design projects that have demonstrated effectiveness. It's not just early innovation now, but I think the picture changes when we are really facing that question of, say, this innovative photography course that's been kind of operating under the radar maybe of big institutions. What does it mean if big institutions want to start to incorporate that, scale that, and what should our stakes be? What should our commitments be coming out of the more scrappy, distributed wilds of the internet kind of space, to making sure that gets done in the ways that are true to our values? I think it is a critical, what I think JSB would call an inflection moment, in that sense that we are realizing, and not only us in the disruptive space, but the us in the institutionalized space, that there is a fundamental disaggregation, what we were talking about in the last panel, between expertise and content delivery, between the instructional coaching, that human touch in the physical location, between assessment and credentialing, that there is a disaggregation going on in that traditional package of higher education that is being reconfigured in some important ways, that's disrupting the business model of higher education. And I wanted to first turn this question over to Anya, because you've done so much thinking about it and a lot of the excavation of the history around this. So given your knowledge of the historical backdrop around the development of our institutions of higher education, what do you see as the important trends, tensions, breakage points right now in today's ecosystem?
I have to say that I'm getting more and more confused. which probably means that I'm learning more and more about it and paying more and more attention. But simultaneous to being immersed in this conversation and all the stuff leading up to it, I've been investigating ideas around the $10,000 degree, which is a mandate that's come down in 4 different states from the level of Republican governors mainly, seeking to mandate that there be an ultra low cost bachelor's degree program available to students in that state. And this is something that was initiated to some extent by Western governors. Their university programs cost about $12,000 for a bachelor's degree, 12, 15. Well, I mean, it can be more than that. It varies. But this is a mandate that's coming in the context of austerity in higher education that's lasted quite a while. And the very same language that's being used in this discussion about innovation and about self-qualification, about speeding, people moving at their own pace and individualized learning, and obviously all the affordances enabled to us by the internet. That exact kind of word for word, those claims and those selling points are being placed into a context of basically a conservative reorganization, privatization of education, and provision of it completely from a market-based perspective, that there not be, really taxpayers involved in subsidizing higher education, that there not be federal student aid programs, and that people basically pursue these things with money from employers, if at all, on their own dime, and it be costing whatever the market can bear. So, that's kind of where, and so in my entire kind of time involved in these conversations, I've been poised on that razor's edge where I'm excited about innovation, I'm interested in differentiation of business models, but this horrible abyss occurs on the other side where people are taking the very same arguments and pushing them toward an eradication of public education, or of education more generally, of learning for its own sake or learning for public good. So I just want to acknowledge those kinds of clouds occurring or massing at the edges of the conversation that we're having here. And I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of these things where we want to hold on to the things that we value so much about our institutions of higher education, while also recognizing that there is some fundamental need for disruption of some of the structures that we've associated with it. And Howard, I think you might be a really excellent person to speak to this, because you're in many ways an embodiment of the ethos of the internet and open, pure communication and learning, and yet you've also been working very hard to bring your approach to learning into these very elite and entrenched kinds of universities. So.
Well, I became concerned about the fact that it wasn't even called social media yet, that students were increasingly immersed, and I felt are going to be immersed throughout their lives with these media that aren't really being discussed in terms of the issues that arise from their use. So I started teaching at Berkeley and at Stanford, and I had sponsors at those places who recognize I'm not an academic, I don't have a PhD, but I'm a good person to talk to students about this subject. So to a certain degree, my sponsors at Cal and at Stanford have insulated me from the institution, yet I have ended up kind of rubbing up against the edges of the institution, trying to innovate. So the subjects that I taught and teach have to do with social media. It only makes sense to use social media if you're going to study them. And as a consequence of that, in part, because when you're having conversations rather than lectures, it does flatten the political hierarchy a little bit, but also because I was a school hater, I really wanted to talk with the students about what was actually working and what could work better. So over a period of time, and a couple of people I talked about this who were knowledgeable pushed me in a direction that was very scary for me, not knowing a lot about how to be a a teacher, not having been trained in it, which was give the students more power and more responsibility over their learning. And when I did a little bit of that, it erupted. People became more enthusiastic, and their feedback became more honest and authentic, and students became co-designers with me. So increasingly, I did more of that. I did wonder why more faculty at Stanford were not using blogs and wikis in their, this is before Twitter even, in their pedagogy. And I asked someone who was an expert in innovations in learning at Stanford, and he said, well, the answer to that's easy. This is a knowledge factory, and you're hired here because of your publications in your field, and if you're supposed to teach a course and you never show up for class, that could be a problem, but there are no positive incentives in the system for innovating. Well, one of the things my students told me was that they were kind of confused about all of the media I was throwing at them, so I entered one of the first haystack competition. I received a small award there, which I used to pay a developer to create what I called the social media classroom that would just enable us to have blogs, wikis, forums, social bookmarking within a uniform browser-based user interface. The award, which was administered through UC, through the MacArthur Foundation, required that I get, what does IRB stand for?
Institutional Review Board.
Institutional Review Board. I had to get an IRB. They're the people who make sure you're not torturing your students to certify that I wasn't doing human experimentation. So kind of Kafkaesque, I needed an IRB to certify I didn't need an IRB. So I sent my request off to the Stanford IRB and heard not from them, but from the provost saying, who is this Rheingold? Where's our 65%? Who is the tenured faculty member who will be the principal investigator? And then I just kind of tossed it, and some genius bureaucrats with UC Irvine, I think, and Stanford had it out, and Stanford finally said, okay, he can have his money, but MacArthur has to take the Stanford name off their website, and he can't use students in this, which irritated me so much that I consulted a lawyer who told me that in the state of California, there is a law that says experimenting with new curriculum is not human subjects research. So I then understood this knowledge factory business, and some things began to make sense to me. Remember, we're talking a few years back here, long before the MOOC business. When I went out to speak about what I was doing, if I talked to professors from elite institutions and I would say, how many people here use Delicious or Digo? Not very many hands would go up. If I talked to people from community colleges or small liberal arts colleges, they all knew about that. And so, again, the same kind of conversation I asked the people at the community colleges, and they said, well, the value proposition here is not that you're going to get the brand name or you're going to get the social network. The value proposition here is that we're going to help prepare you to get a job. So they were very much tuned into what was happening. As a result of this process of giving more and more power to the students, I was asked to do a invited lecture at Berkeley, and part of that involving their faculty and their graduate students. So I told the story of how I've used social media and invited them to help me create a handbook for self-learners. I call it the Pedagogy Handbook. And I met twice on the Berkeley campus with a number of faculty and graduate students. We also had a laptop open with Illuminate, so that people around the world who were interested in the subject, who I just recruited through Twitter and email. They also participated in this conversation. What's interesting is that all of the faculty and grad students at Berkeley dropped out of the project, but we ended up having about 24 people, most of them educators, some of them students, in Mexico and Belgium and Venezuela and Japan, who ended up making this voluntary effort to create a pedagogy handbook. So there's the pedagogy handbook at pedagogy.org. My feeling was if you give more and more of your power as a teacher to the students, can't you just eliminate the teacher altogether? Or can't people alternate being the facilitator of the class? And between the time 9 years ago when I started out on this process and now, clearly there's been an explosion of people learning things together online. So I tend to look out a bit in the future, and I don't really know what's going to happen with the institutions, but I do know that this wild learning out there, that people are becoming more expert at it. I started trying to learn programming this summer, and I think that learning programming and doing programming must be very, very different now from before the web, because if you know the right question to ask and you put it into a search query, there's someone out there on Stack Overflow who's already discussing it. If you know the error message that you get, you can find other people talking about that error message out there. So I think more and more people are getting savvy to the fact that you don't have to go to a university to have access to all of the materials, plus media that the universities traditionally haven't even had. What's missing is how do we learn together? And I cannot dismiss the fact that there are great teachers. There are also a lot of professors who are doing the same lecture they've been doing for 20 years. And I think that those are the people who are seriously threatened. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm all for the knowledge factory. If we're going to get a cure for cancer, it's probably going to come from a knowledge factory. I don't know whether that's the future of the institution of learning. I think that we're seeing all kinds of institutions pop up online that we may see grow into something.
The reason I love your work so much with connected learning, and I think it really hits the nail on the head, is that the question of access and equity is really shifting. I've come across this objection so many times when I've talked about independent learners and describing the kinds of things that you're doing and that you're seeing happen everywhere, because so much social capital supports the independent learner. It's invisible in some ways, but it's really pervasive. And the people that are successful in those ways are really exceptional and or really well supported. But that support doesn't have to come from traditional institutions. So then the question becomes a much larger one, which is how do we develop a kind of society that we want that enables people to become learners who don't need institutions, right, in the same way, but we're building it up somehow, we're sort of fertilizing the soil differently.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this question that you're both raising is really the critical one. Because I think there's a lot of values and goals that we might ascribe to open learning, but if we think of one of the most fundamental social ones is just to say that high quality learning should be available to everybody, right? And we know just open doesn't accomplish that, because that's not how open social networks work. They find ways of being exclusionary, actually. And then we also we know that elite universities don't do that either, because the whole point is to sort and to create differentiations in status. That's one of the side effects of bundling assessment and accreditation with learning. Now, those things don't actually have to go together. In everyday life, we don't bundle assessment and credentialing with learning. The people who help us learn something don't sort us. That there's this weird bundling effect that happens within formal education that creates this confluence between the learning and the accreditation or sorting pieces, which is certainly not a necessary function. So I think the question that I have, and I think, Howard, your, the Rheingold view of this is really illuminating, because the, difference between different institutions of higher education are actually also critically important. The difference between Stanford and community colleges and other ways of learning, the same content that was historically ascribed to higher education. We're having a proliferation of what we might have previously called college or university education. And I guess the question I'd be curious to throw back to both of you, but also anybody else, I mean, especially faculty who, like Howard, have kind of been in the trenches of negotiating these things with your organizations and also with your peers, right, spreading these innovations. Are colleges and universities part of the problem, or are they part of the solution? Or maybe more precisely, which kinds of, or which colleges and universities are part of the solution and which are part of the problem?
Well, the paradox at Stanford is it is a great institution of higher learning consisting of students who've spent their lives shaping themselves so that they can get admitted to a great institution of higher learning. And, I had a surprise midterm exam last quarter in which I asked everyone to submit to me one question that they felt would tell someone in the class whether they understood something from the texts or not. 16 students. And so then I gave them all the 16 questions. I said, write your answers on 16 different pieces of paper, put your name on it, and put the number of the question on it. And then I had people go and collect their question, the one that they had posed, and I said, I want you to grade all of these papers, and then hand them back to people next time. And then, of course, the next question was, how much of our grade is this going to count? And I said, oh, it's not going to count at all. It's for fun. And I got a look. Exactly. If I had said, here is a lovely turd for you, I would have gotten exactly the same look on their face, which was shock and mild disgust. Wasting their time on this, which led to some conversation about the grading business. And so I've had it. I certainly didn't invent this. Ivan Illich wrote about it years ago. John Taylor Gatto has written about it. I think that we have this collision between these great institutions and these students who have worked themselves to get into the great institutions. And so I'm adopting Kathy Davidson's contract grading and peer assessment, and every student in my class this quarter has a choice of doing all of the very many things I'm asking them to do. They've got a blog, they've got to post in the forum, they have to comment on each other's blogs, they've got to write mind maps, they have to give learner lectures. It's a whole lot of stuff. They do it all, they can get an A. But you could do 80% of it, significantly less, and get a B. They all, of course, signed up for an A. We'll see what happens. Oh, and then their peers certify that they have met their contract. Each week, there's a co-teaching team who looks to make sure that everybody's blogged, everybody's done their forum post. And then I've got co-learning teams who are supposed to talk to each other about how they're doing. And I don't know how that's going to go, and I've told them I don't know how that's going to go, and we're going to see. But I know my daughter gets a bonus from her employer that's the appreciation in the stock price over the last year times a number that's derived from her peer evaluations. So being able to evaluate your peers, and everyone, they're transparent, everyone can see how their peers evaluated them. Being able to evaluate your peers honestly, without pissing them off, is an important skill that nobody is learning in one of these places where everybody is grinding for their A. So we'll see. You know, in terms of institutional change, I realized very early I am not an institution changer, but I'm all for experimenting with new ways of doing things and supporting others who are doing it. So you're seeing more and more professors at all kinds of places experimenting with all kinds of things. Just one other story. After all of this trouble with Stanford, where essentially I fly over under the radar, and my department is very happy with me, and I'm happy there, and I don't mess with the provost's office anymore. But then remember Peter Thrun announced that he was quitting because he had 100,000 students and he was creating, was it Udacity that he created, or Coursera? One of the two. 3 months later, there was a new assistant provost for online learning. So suddenly, Stanford is interested in online learning. I read in the newspaper that Berkeley was paying, going to pay professors $30,000 to create online courses. And I thought, gee, I'd like to help them create an online community of Berkeley professors creating online courses. I know how to do that. And so I contacted the assistant provost's office, and he had his assistant make an appointment to Skype with me to vet me. And then I drove to Oakland. I don't ever like to leave home. I am kind of grumpy about it. He made me wait in his office. And then he picked my brain for an hour and a half and said at the end, well, you don't qualify for this. It's just for tenure-track faculty. So I've had it with both institutions in terms of what they really know. We'll see. The person who was just elected the president of the academic senate at Stanford is really concerned about all of this MOOC stuff. And I'm having lunch with him next week. We can talk about other things. Pardon?
Yeah, good luck. I mean, you asked whether colleges and universities are part of the problem, part of the solution. And I mean, I think what makes great universities great is how messy they are. And I constantly marvel at the fact that, like, NYU, this is a headline in Slate recently where they were like, NYU neatly demonstrates everything that sucks about higher education right now. $244,000 degrees, the highest debt in the country, you know, taking over all of the village of New York City, and offering sweetheart loans to its tenure-track faculty while they also open in Abu Dhabi and where there's no civil liberties. So it's like, wow, what a mess, you know. But they host ITP, the Interactive Telecommunications Program, one of the most interesting grad programs in the country, and all kinds of amazing people come there from all over the world because it's in New York City. So I think that the messiness of great universities is actually scarily in danger of being lost. The idea that these kinds of people like you and ideas like this can thrive under the radar, and conversations like this one that sometimes are run counter to the university, because the university is this like maximalist, constantly taking everything up into its maw and making it part of itself and never like letting go. It just grows and grows and grows. And that's what's great about it. But that's exactly what's in danger right now. I mean, we're in this austerity world where people are inventing these degrees that are, there's no courses, there's no professors, there's no classrooms, there's no athletics, there's no extracurriculars. You know, what are you left with? And that sort of becomes like, there's an Edgar Allan Poe story about a general who has, you know, he starts with the gold teeth and he starts taking off his eye socket and his leg, wooden leg, and he's basically down to nothing at the end, right? So I think that we're in, this is a really scary part of what might happen, because the more that we focus on the cost and the conversion rate from dollars to degrees and then degrees to dollars at the other end, the more we're losing the sort of meandering nature of what makes universities really awesome. And I don't know I mean, that's not the kind of thing that can be, it's hard to say how things that you know, ideas and projects that thrive in the shade of like much larger things can continue to survive out in the open space where they're having to constantly justify a budget and do data tracking and metrics and prove their value in various different kinds of ways. I mean, this is what's really tricky about it.
I'm curious if anyone else or any of our innovators, if we have our DS-106 or
Yeah.
Jonathan or FemTechNet, and just how, if you have any stories just to share, or also just, how do we scale the influence of these innovations with or
Yeah.
without the big organizations?
Right.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the DS-106 people are upstairs.
Good.
You're advocating for both places.
Yeah, I'm sorry that Alan's not here to answer that. But one of the things I think that we found at Coventry, and it's not me alone, it's the rest of the team as well, is that I think Jim would sort of agree with this as well with DS-106, is that the institutions generally sort of inhibit innovation in as much as they rely on things running very efficiently. And people that sort of step outside the system to think of perhaps those systems that sit in place generally are there as solutions to problems that were problems some time ago, and the system stays around, but the problems change. And when someone starts to think about new solutions for these new problems, they sit outside the existing system, and they cause drag, and they cause a lot of friction. And so generally those institutions rely on people not questioning what the problem is, or what the answer is. It's been transcribed already, you've been given the answer, just do it. And so when you start to question it, then the system starts to break down, and you can be discouraged from innovating. And so certainly I've spoken to Jim about this, and we've sort of generally agreed that big institutions tend to inhibit innovation because it's inefficient in the short term. Of course, in the long term, it's incredibly short-sighted not to innovate. But certainly in my case, I was enabled to do the open class because the people that I worked with in a tight circle covered for me, so that I could go under the radar to do it outside the system. And lots of little innovations that we've done within FONAR have happened because we've done them in spite of the system. The system is made up of individuals, but so I'm not sure how one builds that into a large system. But I think messiness is definitely a part of it, although messiness is necessarily quite expensive.
I think Liz had a comment to add too. I guess I would just add to this line of questioning then, why do you do it within large institutions? I mean, what is the value you get from being under the radar of a large institution?
Because you have awesome colleagues and awesome students, and it's really fun, but it is exhausting. I still think that Philip Agri's essay, Infrastructure and Institutional Change in the Networked University, is really an awesome essay about this whole question of austerity world that Anya brings up. So basically what he's arguing, and he's reading Lee Starr and these theorists on infrastructure who are often feminist theorists. And he said he points out the fact that there's all this labor that goes into the university that is often undercompensated. And so he points out like the important work that librarians do, or that other kinds of support service people do. And he also talks about the different kinds of soft skills that students get from their university life, and how that kind of mentoring and modeling doesn't get rewarded. And that there's this tendency to, when you try to simplify and make the university less messy with a sort of technocratic agenda, to sort of the first thing that you want to strip out is all of this pesky human labor, which is actually the human labor that goes into making the learning happen. So I think that the sad thing is, this desire for the kind of elegant, perfect, streamlined university leads to this thing that is just antithetical to actual learning and knowledge making.
But there's values inscribed in what you're saying too, because my understanding is that on an economic basis, the growth in the budgets of universities in the United States is coming on the administrative side, not on the faculty side. And in every possible way, the people that have contact hours with students are getting the shaft, and the roles are growing on the administrative side. And not to say that those aren't necessarily important roles, but it's hard to justify that, and except in terms of there's some kind of perverse connection between how much your job involves having contact with students and helping them grow in these ways, and how much it's respected and how much is paid. You know what I'm saying? Like, and even within faculty members, there's a hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean,
of-
what I would encourage is that there's this sort of tendency to do this, and I know you don't do that because you try to do a kind of more careful reading of the economics of the university, but there's a tendency to sort of hate administration. And the thing is that there's a lot of administration that has to do with people talking to each other, like people talking to each other in different departments, or people talking to each other in different campuses, or making sure that faculty and students are talking to each other. And that's often the kind of administration that isn't rewarded and compensated for. So I wouldn't say that, and I think this is Egri's point too, is that the administration is actually a remarkably heterogeneous category that involves a lot of kinds of human infrastructural investments that are difficult to map.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, there's a comment over there.
Thanks. I just wanted to respond to your question about if it's so messy, why do we keep doing it here? I just don't think many of us have a choice. I mean, if you want to innovate in education, you're going to be involved in education, and the funds are generally in the large research institutions, which are not designed to innovate teaching, right? This is not what we do here. I mean, except if you're in the education department, most of us are going rogue, I think is what you were suggesting, or under the radar, to innovate and implement some of these changes. And so it is inevitably messy, and we will, sort of the underground element will come above, and there will be sort of paradigm shifts and pendulum swings. And I think that's part of it. I mean, it's sort of trying to figure out where we are in these different movements is the complicated thing. But why do we do it? Because we have to, and we don't have a choice.
Well, yeah, so I guess I come from the wilds of the internet. So the learners and innovators who aren't affiliated with elite institutions at all. So we've had people mention things like Stack Exchange, and I study, gamer wikis and, all the stuff that is just happening organically without any sanctioned stamp of educational institutions. And so I think that what we're talking about is an intersection between some very interesting things, like, and Howard sits right at that nexus of being sort of an organic internet learner, but interfacing with institutions. And then there's faculty who are traditional tenured faculty who are also feeling this drive towards a similar kind of learning model, but doing it within the institutional frame. And so I think it's an interesting moment where those things are potentially flowing together, right? But as somebody, I do something similar. I've been affiliated with universities, but I've never had a faculty position, and I've operated under the radar, and that feels very comfortable to me because, like Liz is saying, there's this incredible infrastructure that you benefit from. It's not just straight funding and salary, but it's an infrastructure and a set of resources that you can't really, yeah, I mean, it's amazing in a lot of ways. And when I look at young people's organic learning communities, they are amazing too from a learning perspective and a lot of the values around peer learning and so on. But they don't have that infrastructure, and there's a point at which, I'll advocate for the other side, which is to say, I don't know if all of these scrappy innovations will actually make a big difference in the world if we can't get buy-in from our big institutions. So much as I agree that innovation has to happen in the messy margins, big social impact, like the change the world stuff, I kind of think the big guys have to be on board for this party. And so that's kind of the critical question and inflection point I think we're at today is, what does it take to move from the under the radar innovation, really cool stuff that we all love, but we're not going to tell the guys upstairs about, and really having the organizations be part of the remaking of this. Now, it may be naive to say that that's just going to happen, because
I can tell you about one little point of recognition or connection that's happening right now is the Obama administration just made a room for beyond the credit hour, competency-based learning, right? And this idea that you're going to directly assess learning. It doesn't matter where the learning came from, how the person acquired the learning, We're going to create assessments as a faculty that we're confident in, and that people can complete those assessments, and they're often they can be performance-based, in situ simulations, papers, or exams. We're going to give you the degree. So University of Wisconsin is developing this. I think of the publics, they're putting the most energy and effort behind it. And they're explicitly designated open learning as one of the ways that people can get credit. So then you move into this paradigm where it's prior learning, in the sense it's open learning, and then you come in under the auspices of an organization wherever you can get kind of the best fit for your credits and your background, and they certify that learning for you, and they may provide add-on services like mentoring and advising and helping you structure your learning program. But like, I find that kind of exciting, that idea that you can take this learning and get the degree, and do it on your own time, in your own terms, and follow your own interests, and then figure out where that, take that portfolio and figure out where it places in the world. And I think it speaks to the strengths of the existing institutions of certification and sorting and recognition, figuring out what's good and what's bad. And, it can affect both sides, I think, in an interesting way. It's a lot looser structure. The university is not saying we're going to create all the courses and you have to sit with us and give you, on the time frame that we say, and you can only get the learning here. They're saying we're going to certify it and you can take it anywhere you want.
Yeah, so there may be some policy level pressures that are really
Yeah, well,
there.
yeah. I mean, I got involved in a conversation about a bill that was introduced in the House of Representatives, which is going to experimentally certify people to get Pell Grants, partial Pell Grants for open learning. So I think that's pretty awesome. That on a course level, that if people want to engage in this stuff, but they don't have the financial support to do it, that they should be able to do that.
Interesting. So this was a question that came up in Twitter in the last session, or the session before, that I didn't get a chance to throw out to the group, but I think it's relevant to the conversation we'd like to move to next, which is, what should we do next? But first, just to ask the people who have been, doing open courses and supporting open learning, how are you sharing your innovations? Are you finding resonance among your colleagues? What are the mechanisms, sort of putting aside the big institutionalized platforms, for getting this stuff to spread? Howard or anybody, you have some stories to share.
Well, I certainly had a conversion experience from DS 106, and not from Harvard or Stanford, but from the University of Mary Washington, is, I think, a great example of open learning in lots of senses. Here they are.
Oh, right on cue. We have a question for you.
So in the process of interviewing Jim Groom about DS 106, he convinced me that I needed to open up for the students' sake, their learning needed to happen in public. So I had this, remember the story about the social media classroom was a very useful instrument, but it's not open to everyone. And DS 106, not only are there people who are not enrolled at the university who participate, but there are students who took the class last year who participate. And that struck me. I thought, that's a kind of an artificial barrier that maybe doesn't need to exist. I'm in touch with students, a few of them who have taken my course in previous years, who are still interested in the subject. And in some cases, you become more interested in the subject after you've taken it. So following Jim's directions, Jim showed me how to set up a domain and a server and a WordPress blog and a media wiki, and we recorded it. So we have 3 hours of screencast about exactly how to go about it. And we also talked about why to go about it, about the fact that the students do have digital profiles, whether they like it or not. They might as well take control of it and pump out some good stuff. Also, the value of having blogging something about your learning and having people from 2 or 3 different countries making intelligent comments on it, I think, is self-evident in comparison to writing a paper for your professor who may give you a good grade or a bad grade, and you're going to stash that paper away, or maybe not even stash it away. So I'm just starting the experiment, and I'll have to say that it's pretty promising. I warned everybody who registered for this class that it was going to be a big pain, and that it was going to be a lot of, I quote from one of my anonymous evaluations, too many moving parts. And so I sent them this long letter 2 weeks before the first class about setting up their WordPress blog, about registering for the wiki, registering for the forum, and a week before class, people were blogging. And we walked into class, and all of these people were looking at each other as people whose thoughts about the class they already knew. And so now we had the first class on Tuesday, and it's really coming to life, and people from elsewhere in the world are commenting on it. It's socialmediaissues.net. I invite anybody to go and make a comment on one of the students' blogs there. Also, there's a forum that contains private spaces for us to talk about our classroom community and to talk about our texts, and what I call a fishbowl space where anybody can join us. And so already we're 2 days past the first class meeting. People from the rest of the world and people from the class are having forum discussions about what they want to talk about. So I'm going to reserve judgment till I see how the whole quarter plays out, but you get a sense of how whether a class is gelling into a learning community or not, and sometimes it takes weeks to happen, which is a problem if you've got a quarter system, because you only got 10 weeks. Seeing it happen before the first class meeting, that's really exciting. It's exciting to me, and it's exciting to them. And so today I made a radical blog post to the students. Naturally, since I've got all these moving parts, I'm getting all of these emails saying, I'm not sure what's the difference between a blog post and a forum post, and I forgot my login, and I'm sorry to bother you. And everybody said, I'm sorry to bother you. So I did a blog post saying, I'm going to declare myself available 24/7. You can email me about anything at any time, and you'll get an answer really soon. Maybe not when I'm sleeping. So we'll see. I find it to be pretty rewarding. I think in a week or so, I'll stop getting so many emails, and they will start doing this more and more in public.
So the question was, how do we share some of the innovations that we sort of do? So originally, bear in mind that it was born out of asking people for help. It was the open class, the Phonar class. I presume that people would just, being as it's open, would naturally sort of, I mean, it's licensed BY, it's licensed BY, it's licensed to use and share. I presumed people would take it and remix it and make it better. But it turned out that in fact there is a process of education there that educators need as well, that it's actually okay to explicitly to take this and improve on it and then share it back again. And so I was kind of wondering if maybe the stuff that I was doing was just rubbish, and so people weren't that interested in using it. And so I thought, okay, so passive open isn't working. So I'm going to aggressively try a sort of active open now. And so I went to the European sort of photo educators meetup, and there was a whole bunch of them there. And when I gave a presentation, I showed the class. I explained how people could take the assignments. They could change them, switch them around, and 72 people signed up to become editors on last year's iteration of the class. So they had full editing rights on the syllabus, on the tasks and everything. And still, there were two changes, two contributions. So it was quite difficult. So I haven't got it. Doesn't have a happy ending yet, right? So what we've done this year is we've built this thing called Phonar Ed, which is Phonar for educators, and it is explicitly a place to come and ask, how can I do a version of this myself? Because within the department, what we've found is that when you share with colleagues, they're generally terrified at the idea of having to replicate what you've done, because you're 4 years down the line, and that's an awful thing to ask somebody to do. And so the message that we have to sort of get out is, actually, the last thing you want to do is try and do it like I do it. That would be entirely inappropriate, because you teach in a completely different way. You're a great insert speaker, writer, whatever it is. You know, the way you teach would lend itself necessarily perhaps to a podcast, or perhaps to perhaps being filmed, or perhaps just being written down and downloaded as a PDF, and then maybe hosted as a conversation later in the week. All these things are open. A visit to a museum in which you ask people to tweet about it and then aggregate those notes afterwards. That's a great open learning experience. So I think getting that message out, that in fact there isn't just one silver bullet or one appropriate or one way of doing this. In fact, it's okay to do it messily again, whilst we're all learning. The important thing is to share it back, to share back your mistakes, because they're the most valuable bits very often, because that helps us all to be a bit more efficient. And then the institutions enable us to innovate a bit more, because, you know, we don't make quite as many mistakes. I'm going off on one. Anyway. So there, but it doesn't have a happy ending, so please go to Phonar Ed and join in.
It sounded pretty happy to me. I don't know, I had posed a question to the DS 106 team of just, you know, we're sort of moving to a conversation about what might we want to do next, and what do we need in order to have these innovations start spreading more widely. And, you know, curious for those of you who have been in the trenches, how you're sharing and what kind of uptake you're seeing among your colleagues, if any.
I blog voraciously. I mean, DS 106 somewhat happened because of the chemistry of some people who came together in the beginning who were not exactly in the same circles, and there were some key people who kind of wandered in kind of by serendipity. So a piece of it, wow, I'm really struggling here to tell you exactly. Because, you know, the group that was upstairs, we struggled a little bit with what exactly we were doing. You know, trying to come up with how do you build an open course to teach people how to build an open course when you want to allow for so many variations that Jonathan described. So I don't know if we hit the mark or missed it on there. So I think a piece of it is, you know, if you're in the room as a practitioner and you're not openly sharing your work, you know, now's the time to set up a site at Reclaim Hosting or whatever, and get your work out there in some sort of network community. But I imagine most people in this room are already part of this. The other thing is, like, I think people who are in this room are kind of already in the game here. And are we trying to broaden that circle? You know, what's the group we're trying to get into moving into this Reclaim teaching in this open learning format? I mean, what Howard described, you know, it might scare people off because it is a lot of work. And I won't, you know, when I've taught this as adjunct, you know, Howard and I were joking about our pay raise at doing this open learning, you know, and he was at 72 cents an hour. I was about 60 cents an hour. I'm less efficient, but not doing it for the money. But, you know, there are things that happen that transcend money in terms of the connections that are made from this. And honestly, I learn as much doing this in the teaching as I do in the teaching part of it. I'm not answering your question at all, Mimi.
No, you are.
Yeah.
We're both putting in the hours because we are completely fascinated and rewarded by and drawn to the energy that comes out of this. It's you create the scene, and then these students populate it, and it comes alive. And that's so much different from walking into the classroom once again and doing the same old thing. It's more work, so much more work, but it's very exciting.
But you guys need to be careful about creating a paradigm where this is all just for the passion, for the love, like, right? Got to get paid and got to be valued. And, you know, I just think, I mean, I say you guys because I have a weird other way of making a living doing this, and I don't actually teach people, but I just think that, like, because you're also, and I think Jonathan talked about this a little bit, you're putting that forth to your students as well. They want to be able to join a community of practitioners who are also creating value. And part of the way that traditional education is shortchanging people is by telling them not to worry about that stuff until it's far too late. So, you know, I just want to stipulate that. Everybody got to get paid.
I actually was over here madly putting duct tape and twine on the website that we're going to show you in a minute. So I didn't catch the whole question, but I think one of the things that Alan was alluding to, I wanted to just mention, which was sort of how something like DS-106 comes to happen. And we get this question a lot. I have to say, we get this question a lot about the work that we do at Mary Washington. People will say, well, there must just be something in the water of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and, you know, that's the only possible explanation. But in reflecting upon what happened the spring that Jim decided to open up that class, the reason why that worked was because of the time and energy that Jim had devoted for many years into cultivating his own social network and building a community and being part of a community, sharing and contributing. And so when the time came for him to say, hey, is anybody interested in doing this? There were people who were willing to go on that journey with him. And so I think part of the answer of, like, how do we do more of this is that more of us need to be engaged with those spaces. And, you know, I talk with faculty a lot who'll be like, ugh, Twitter. Why would I use Twitter? And Twitter is why DS-106 happened, you know, because Jim had a network on Twitter that trusted him and believed in him. And to think that those spaces can't cultivate that kind of trust and belief is devaluing what they are. And so I think all of us being, you know, holding all of those spaces and ourselves to higher standards is part of the answer.
Also wanted to invite Freeman and Janice. You have a very different kind of institutional affiliation than the university folks too, so I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, I'm sort of playing off what Martha said about community, because one of the things that, so after FemTechNet got some attention from Fox News, we ended up kind of getting approached by a lot of people who were interested in joining the network. Awesome! Except they were all, I have this project, and it seems like you guys are really good at getting stuff done, and I would like you to, like, do my project for me. Because it seems like you have a lot of students who could then, like, contribute this labor, and so this would be great for me. And so Alex Juhas has this hilarious sort of standard email that she writes back that's designed in a very nice way to make the differentiation between being a community and being a service. And, like, you know, saying that is great that you have enthusiasm and ideas, and we encourage you to join a committee, and we encourage you to marshal allies. And, you know, we really do want you to join us, but, you know, you need to, like, figure out how to bring more people on board so that they can work with you rather than just for you. So I think that's the hard transition sometimes to make, is when you get in this mindset where you just kind of just do things because you just want to see projects that you believe in move forward, but, like, figure out how to set up those community norms so that they actually can continue to move forward and they don't just depend on the labor of a very small number of people.
So I'm excited about forums like this since I'm so outside regular sort of academic circles. I'm really just sort of pushing forward on my own and then looking for visibility at some level of just sort of, I feel what we're doing is something that needs to get tried, and then, but I don't have the resources because we're so small to take it further. And so having a forum like this where we simply sort of look at people like us and other sort of smaller people who are making experiments in this area, I think will be, useful in being able to propagate it out further for sort of non-academics.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear, because that's you. That was one of our hopes with this event, was to be able to surface connections that might not have already been there. Josie, did you have anything to add in terms of how you connect to broader communities? And
So obviously we blog, we use different social media channels. We actually have a program requirement. Anything we fund has to be openly licensed and put out. So in terms of engaging in the project,
Sorry, me to abandon you here.
the educators have to go through the process of understanding what that means and how you do that and what the implications of doing that are as part of the process of the project as a whole.
Could you repeat that?
I was just saying that, yeah, we put out, we blog. I'm on Twitter. Obviously, the rest of the team are on Twitter. We actually recruited our key worker through Twitter, and we use different social media channels to capture and share outputs. It's also a requirement of any project that we fund that the outputs be released openly. So that gives educators an opportunity to explore what that process is, to understand what the implications of that are, and learn how that works for themselves as well. In terms of kind of scale and process, the approach that we've taken is around, so in terms of scale, our process is scalable. So our framework is transferable to many, many educational institutions for people who work with 11 to 18-year-old young people. They can take our framework, which is also openly licensed, and our content, our survey content, and they can use that, and they can use that in kind of remixed ways as well. So, for example, our e-safety and online identity strand is designed to support UK government inspection standards around e-safety within schools. So any UK school could just strip that strand out, use it to create their own audit of staff to feed into that process. Our technical, our strand around technology-supported professional development is closely aligned to the teaching professional standards in the UK, which are not explicit in terms of use of technology, but we've framed them in such a way as to be supportive of those standards via the use of technology and via the development of the use of technology as well. So our kind of process is transferable. De Montfort University is looking at framing the structure for staff who work in the university sector, and what I would be hopeful to do, I'd very much like to look at framing it for staff that work with younger children as well, because it's not a straight transfer at the moment, but it can be done. And then in terms of kind of reach, I think how we've tried to engage with individuals and communities across the spread of the city and the schools is by offering routes to connect to the project at the level of individual educators, at the level of departments within schools, and at the level of whole school. So if, for example, you're in a school whose priorities are not around the kinds of work that we're doing, but you're one of these under-the-radar educators who are doing really innovative things and are really interested in taking practice forward, you can connect with us on that basis. And that's kind of one of the approaches that we're looking at, that very complex issue of working with a lot of organisations with very different cultures and a lot of individuals with very different priorities and requirements as well.
no, that's super interesting. Sort of just to start gathering up these threads of conversation, I mean, I feel like with this event, I was really just inspired by the fact that there is so much amazing innovation happening, and it is totally messy and heterogeneous and chaotic in some ways, but I also feel that there's a lot of shared values and principles that could be surfaced and stitched together, not in And I think the message coming, it's not straight replication, right? I mean,
Right.
there's got to be a different model of doing this and sharing and talking, because it's by nature cross-sector and
Yeah.
or undisciplined or transdisciplinary and a lot of other things. But I do feel like, you know, there are certain principles with how you engage with the open space, certain kinds of dilemmas, common dilemmas faced by a lot of the projects that I feel like we're kind of at the beginning of starting to explore. And I'm going to turn over to Anya and Howard maybe to talk a little bit about, you know, this question of visibility and storytelling and kind of getting the message out in ways that are possibly, you know, crossing some of these networks, and also whether we can report back on the
Okay,
awesome
yeah.
course you guys are been
Um,
building in real time.
So we couldn't get the projector to work. That was a horrible grinding noise. So if you have a device, open it up. And I just want to respond to what you just said, because I was really surprised to hear myself making this argument, and I don't see this guy here, so I'm going to throw him under the bus. We were talking at lunch. It's a startup guy, and he's like, there's so many smart people here, and there's so many cool conversations going on, but you've got to decide what this is really about so that you can move it forward. And I was like, that is not the point at all, actually. Actually, the point is to keep asking questions and to keep feeling that energy and to keep identifying maybe principles and to move toward. But I think defining an agenda and moving, I mean, it's never going to evolve that way. It's never going to grow that way. It has to keep going and keep changing. But yeah, why don't you guys describe what you actually set up, and we'll give the URLs. Yeah.
Well, we started out with the idea of creating a course on open learning, and quickly evolved or devolved to, well, how do you create a course on
That was what I hoped it would.
open learning?
Yeah.
And very quickly started throwing together some pieces on a Google Doc, and Anya and I and a couple of other people tweeted it, and gee, within a minute, the Google Doc crashed. There were,
Yeah.
I don't know, 50 or 100 people trying to edit it. So the idea was to just put some messy stuff up, and we would make it less messy later. And then Martha came in and created a WordPress instance, and we developed this kind of scheme whereby if there is any remaining community out there who wants to continue this creation of, I guess, a kit for creating open online courses, then here's a mechanism whereby people can make suggestions for all of the things that you need, and presumably there will be some people who are committed enough to it to be editors who will take those suggestions and implement them on the WordPress site. Now, I'll have to say that this is probably going to come to nothing, but I was happy to see that the pedagogy.org, all of these people working for, nothing. Well, other than the fact that we were all excited about it, worked for over a year on this and made a pretty good site with videos and indexes and all kinds of things. So the container is there at...
I'm tweeting it out again right now.
Okay. Reclaimcourse.org, reclaimopen.org. So you're tweeting out the Google Doc as well?
Yeah, I'll tweet out the.
So you'll see that the Google Doc is kind of the messy start, and that's how we did the pedagogy. Was we started with a wiki, and then we decided we needed to have a mechanism for people who were self-electing to write articles on the wiki to say, okay, this is ready for editing, and then for an editor to come in and say, okay, this is ready for WordPress, and then for someone to say, this has been moved to WordPress. So it was a messy process, but in the end, we ended up having a mechanism that worked pretty well, and so maybe this will be as well. The idea being that people would be able to, I don't know whether you've looked at any of these MOOC builders, but boy, it's a lot of work. And it's really like producing a movie or producing a television series. And this was a kind of different approach. It was, how do you want to govern it? What kind of technology do you want to use? How are you going to convene it? What are the resources available? And are those resources free, or what are their advantages and disadvantages? Presumably, if this all got filled out and organized, then people would go and say, okay, here's a resource on how I can organize a syllabus or a learning space, and here are a lot of suggestions for good learning activities, and here's why I should use a wiki rather than a forum, and kind of lubricate the process of creating an online course. That's the intention. It'll be interesting. Maybe we will come back here and meet in a year, and I will say, well, as most of these efforts go, nothing happened. Or maybe something will happen. And I think that's what it's all about.
It's up to you.
You put it out there, tell your friends. You know, there are some people who see fun and learning and advantage into doing the work of editing this. Most of the work in putting together the WordPress part of pedagogy was from someone who had just left their job at Mozilla and was looking for something interesting to do, and a graduate student in education in England who was procrastinating on his thesis. So are all kinds of people out there who can contribute little bits to something like this, and it can come together.
Okay, sounds good. I think just my hope was that the people who took part in it would have some needs fulfilled as far as answering these questions or asking them themselves in the process of trying to solve them, which I think is the way to do it, at least for me. So.
And it's an invitation to anybody who wants to participate in the process.
Definitely.
I think it will stick around the process long enough to help some leaders emerge.
Well, my brief as far as following up with this is I'm going to be profiling all of the winners, and then we created a gallery site for all of the entrants, and we're hoping that people are going to be able to contribute to that and sort of have a place to go to look for experiments like these, because I think there's a lot of value in sort of seeing what other people are doing in this area, and sort of figuring out what the differences are and why they're important. So that's part of it as well.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that piece. For
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
David, I didn't know if you wanted to sort of move this party to a close, and I'll just, while David's coming up here, if folks have other things that they want to put on the table as next steps or things that they might like to have on the radar for this community, now's the time.
So we thought we'd just open it to thinking aloud together about where you might want to take your work. Are there possibilities of taking some of this work forward together? Just to reiterate that we will be continuing to think about forums of bringing folks together in the name of sort of pushing these boundaries. I do want to say just a couple of things that have been prompted by the last 24 hours, and also in response to the discussion about institutional reification. I think there are two important reasons not to give up on universities or institutions like universities. I mean, for one, there's a reason we're sitting in this space at the moment. It makes possible resources that might not otherwise be available, and one needs to look to draw on those resources in ways in which more conventional colleagues draw on those resources all the time in order to do their work to push the boundaries, right? So that's the first sense that there are incredible resources within big learning institutions like the University of California and other institutions. Even while they frame and delimit and so on, there are, institutions are not hegemonic. Even while they pretend to be hegemonic, there are all kinds of gaps and possibilities within them, and the trick is to find, where those resources are. The second, equally, if not more important reason, not to give up on institutions, is they represent enormous ranges of people within them, and enormous, particularly young people who represent a kind of future. And if you give up on institutions of that kind, there's a degree to which one's giving up on a very vast range of people, of reaching people in various kinds of ways. Which is not to say working only within those institutions, but as many people in this room do, working with them and in them and beyond them, and pushing the boundaries of them in a variety of ways. So I think it's, the University of California, $24 billion a year corporation, after all, is also, engaged in the practice of online education, much like every other institution around here. And it's really, really, really conventional. So how do you get at them in a way to, who are the people leading these ventures, speaking to or not speaking to, and how does one get to them in order to open up those spaces to more innovative and creative ways to reach people connected to the learning possibilities. So I just want to end by just thinking about the comment I made at the outset, that the learning should drive the technology, not the technology, the learning, and just tweak that a little bit by saying, in relation to a remark that JSB made last night in response to that, was it's the play between the learning and the technology which obviously push each other, right, to innovative spaces. And then in the light of things that were said this morning, right, that context is really, really important, and learning takes place not just anywhere and any time, but in many, many ways. And one needs to be open to the valences and places and forms in which learning takes place, and think about where, right, as opening up possibilities for learning, where one's intervening, how one's intervening in those spaces, what technologies one's drawing on in relation to the registers of learning that are taking place, and so on. So having said that, let me open it to any further remarks before we then close it down for possible futures together.
Well, I just wanted to share with you that I'm very happy that I made it down here today. I haven't had the chance to talk to all of you, but quite to some. And also following this discussion, I feel that there's a lot for me to take home to Germany, where we are actually setting up a forum, working together with German universities, with the Rectors' Conference, and it's supported by the Federal Ministry, and it's related to digital education. So in a way, I would be very happy to keep the contact and to maybe share some of the findings that we will have there, some of the innovations that hopefully will take place there. And certainly there's a lot to share and to connect with, so thank you.
I just want to reinforce what David said about the importance of using our existing, albeit possibly antiquated, infrastructure And I think that there are two reasons for that. First of all, it's here. Second of all, people are used to using it. And one of, I think, the great promises of open learning and of distance learning and all of that kind of stuff is that we can develop tools and techniques that, in fact, can be ported back into the residential experience. And that is the way in which we can bridge the gulf. Because a lot of people who are very excellent teachers in a residential experience are willing to reach out, but they're not necessarily at the stage of the game where they can make that massive investment of going to a new method of going. So I think that this is a very promising avenue, and I encourage people who are developing these tools to publicize them, not just simply as the fact that they'll work with tens of thousands of students, but they may actually work with the relatively small class of 550 to 600 students that we confront here.
I think that's it.
Okay, so I mean, it does seem like we've talked ourselves to silence. We will look for ways to continue to push the envelope in these regards, both outside the institution, within the institution, in the spaces between the inside and the outside. And we look forward to continuing to engage you and to follow you and to have you sort of look to us for possible reconvenings into the future. I want to thank the co-organizers. I want to thank all of you for taking the time out and spending time with us thinking through these things. It's been enormously engaging and a conversation that opens up. I look forward to personally engaging with many of you going forward and travel safely for those of you who are traveling back. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.